It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. But I do know what I'm doing right now, which is interviewing Maggie McMuffin for this episode of Ekphrasis on Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. In this episode, we're going to discuss mental illness, suicidal ideation, and show some artistic renderings of both of those things. So if that doesn't feel right for you right now, then we invite you to join us on our next episode. But for those of you who are going to stick around to open up the bell jar, let's start by learning a little about Sylvia Plath.
Primarily known as a poet, Sylvia Plath's semi-autobiographical novel The Bell Jar was originally published under a pseudonym, Victoria Lewis, in 1963, the same year in which she died by suicide. The novel chronicles Esther Greenwood's descent from post-collegiate malaise to clinical depression and electroconvulsive therapy treatments, which seem less like treatment and more like torture. While the book could be interpreted through a feminist lens as an examination of the social pressures placed on women in the mid-century, or through a disability studies lens to expose the inherent ableism in medicine, the expressivist reading is hard to ignore given the parallels to Plath's own life. Expressivism is a point of view that interprets art as a true expression of the artist's feelings and experiences. Reading Plath's biography alongside Esther Greenwood's story shows that the narrative expresses many of Plath's own experiences through her main character, hence why it's been dubbed semi-autobiographical, and why an expressivist reading feels close to home for this novel.
Hello and welcome to Ekphrasis. My name is Sailor St. Clair and I am the co-artistic director of Novelties Theatre. And today I'm chatting with Maggie McMuffin about Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. Maggie is a performance artist, sex worker, and script consultant based in New York City. Maggie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. You know that I love getting together and talking about art that I have nothing to do with.
You have something to do with it. You made a piece of art about this book.
I guess that's true. I'm just always really excited just to discuss books with you.
Well, that's my favorite thing to do. So I'm happy to talk about this book with you. So maybe let's start there. Why did you choose The Bell Jar?
This is going to make me sound like the worst, but I chose it specifically because my clown character, who I adapted this through, is named Bonnabelle, and I was like, oh, she's a sad clown. The Bell Jar is a sad book. Bonnabelle Jar, it works, and that was entirely why I chose it.
We love a pun. A pun is great. And, you know, Sylvia Plath is a poet. I bet she'd be down with that wordplay. I'm sure she's giving you props somewhere through a parallel dimension or spiritual realm, I hope. Okay. So we will talk about Bonnie Bell and your clown character in a minute, but I want to know more about when you first read The Bell Jar, and if this was a first read for you, a second read. So tell me about how you encountered it.
It was kind of a first read for me. I had been introduced to it in high school, like most depressed white girls, and I remember one of my very good friends at the time was reading it and she was raving about it. And I was like, oh, I'll read it too. Because at the time, like I had read Girl Interrupted. I was reading a lot of Chuck Palahniuk. I was trying to read other novels where the protagonists aren't necessarily aspirational. Mm-hmm. And so I tried reading The Bell Jar, and in my memory, I had gotten like halfway through it and just never finished it for whatever reason. And then I think I was going to use it for an essay in high school. And then my teacher convinced me that another choice would be better. Then I started reading it to put together a pitch for Novelties and realized that I had gotten maybe 1.5 chapters in.
Oh, wow. So okay.
Yeah, I was like, oh, wow, I really believed in high school me. And I ended up reading it the way through. I've now read it multiple times. I've read some passages of it, God knows how many times, in trying to figure out exactly which one I was going to use for this and how I was going to pick it apart and present it. So I went from having not read very much of the novel at all, like 15 years ago, to reading it multiple times in the span of a couple of months.
That's really, I think, interesting that it was something that you read in high school. Because first of all, who is assigning this in high school? This book feels, this was my second reading it with you to prepare for this interview. And I had read it in college, which feels like the right time to read it, right? You're at the same age as Esther Greenwood. You know, she's like 19, 20, 21. So when you're reading it, when you're 19, 20, 21, you're like, I too have no idea what I am doing in New York or anywhere else. What even is life? In high school, it feels perhaps like the experience doesn't quite match up. Like, was it a cautionary tale? Why did they assign it to you?
Oh, it wasn't assigned.
It was just for fun.
Yeah, I was one of those precocious high school students who like read Tess of the D'Urbervilles when I was 14 at a cookout because I didn't want to talk to anyone.
I did that with Virgin Suicides once, so maybe I am more like you than I initially let on. But so you're reading it again now, and you have this distance from maybe the age of Esther Greenwood, because you're a little bit older than her. So how does it strike you reading it now, as opposed to, you know, when you like read it in high school to ignore people?
Well, I think in high school reading it, because like you said, Esther is older, she's in New York. There's a lot of glamour in the book, or seeming glamour, especially in the only part that I read in high school. And so there isn't really an ability to feel guilt over wasting your life. And there isn't, it's more like, oh, someday I'm going to get to go to a big city and be sad there instead. And that just, I feel like when you're 16, 17 years old, that feels like such an upgrade to be sad somewhere like New York City.
So that idea of being sad in a different city, you are a New Yorker now, but I know you from when you used to live in Seattle. So tell me a little bit about what it's like to read this book as a New Yorker.
I mean, it definitely captures the adventure feeling of New York, especially when you aren't fully a New Yorker, because Esther is just there for a summer. And I remember when I first started visiting New York, I was also very sad about things. I cried a lot. I felt very much like it was safe to cry in New York because no one gives a shit about anything that you're doing. But also there's so much to do. The scene where her and Doreen are like in a taxi and they just jump out to go into a bar with strangers. I was like, yeah, that actually happens. I thought that was completely fabricated until I lived in New York for a couple of years. And I was like, oh no, shit like that just happens. Living in New York is basically like living in Burning Man all the time. There's just constant adventure and detours and things to catch your attention.
So tell me a little bit about your clown character. So she's Bonnie Bell Blue. That's her name, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about how you created her and how you got into clowning.
So I got into clowning, which on my Facebook memories today is actually 5 years since I came out as a clown and was like, I'm a clown. I've been denying it for so long, but I am one. Which was like 5 years ago. It was a huge step for me because I had so much imposter syndrome about being a clown. I loved clowns since I was a child. I just thought they were neat. And I wanted to study clowning in college, but there was only one clowning class. And honestly, looking back, I was not ready for it because I was still trying too hard to be showy with comedy and to get laughs and not really living in the moment like I should have been. But looking back, I can be like, oh, but I can like see the lessons that I was taught and like apply them now. And I've taken clowning workshops since then. I've done clown classes. I've done clown intensives. I've done work with other clowns. Primarily, I use clowning as a medium to sort of play with emotional honesty, but also a lot of sex stuff. I love doing sex clowning. I love making clown porn. I love being a clown on burlesque stages. I feel I'm my most powerful when I'm a clown, and I feel like I can do anything. And where that comes into play with Bonnabelle is Bonnabelle was a character who just kind of appeared for me at a time when I was very sad and I was barely functional. I was not in a good place. I was really, really not in a good place, but I work a lot. I throw myself into work when I'm in a happy place, in a sad place, in a bad place, in a good place. So I kind of made Bonnabelle so that if I looked sad, I could actually lean into it because it would just look like I was committing to the bit more. So it was very much like I created a false mask when really what I was doing was tearing my face off. And since then, I've used her. I've done a couple of acts as her, exploring aspects of my mental health, of my mental illness, specifically through a feminized lens, because very frequently women's mental health is not taken as seriously as men's mental health. And I also noticed that when you look at a lot of clowns who are like, they're sad clowns, they're usually male presenting clowns or male or more mask of center clowns, because some of the clowns I know are non-binary. And it's playing with that more masculine sense of emotion, whereas feminine emotion is usually like you're being histrionic, you're being dramatic, you're being a Lana Del Rey knockoff, all these things.
Yeah, there's two things in there that I think are interesting that you're talking about, like the sad clown archetype being male. I mean, we had, like, you go to Pagliacci, right, in the opera, and that is maybe your sad clown. You know much more about clowning than I do, but that might be what most folks might think of first, right? The idea of this clown who cries coming from that Italian opera. And then also the thing that you're saying about women's mental health not being taken as seriously really strikes me in terms of the bell jar. So I'm sort of starting to see how you're putting these things together in this crucible. So tell me a little bit more about your piece that you created that we'll watch in a couple minutes, where Bonnie Bell is doing the Bonnie Bell jar. So tell us a little bit about your creative process for this.
So the creative process was hard because I got accepted for this and I was like super excited and I was in a pretty good place mentally. And then my mental health just plummeted. And so a lot of the creative process for this actually took place parallel to me doing the most intense mental health work I've ever done, which I did not mean to happen. And it made me like, there were some days when I woke up and I was like, okay, I'm going to get through this. I'm going to be Bonnabelle. I'm going to be the character. I'm going to focus. I'm just going to pick this apart. And I was very technical with everything because I just didn't want to deal with the emotions. And then there were other days when I was like, I cannot look at this material at all. I need to not be looking at this. I need to not risk identifying with this and romanticizing what I'm going through. I just need to set it aside. And for that reason, I'm so glad that we had a long gestational process here that normally does not happen with burlesque and normally doesn't happen with filmed and virtual shows that are happening. Timelines haven't really shifted for filming for shows. And it was, the first time I read it was before all of this happened. And so that for me was actually the big distinction, was reading it just 2 months apart when I was doing pretty well. And I was like, I'm upbeat and I've got a camera and I'm doing art and stuff. And I'm moving on from some recent trauma and the trauma of the world. And then it was, and then rereading it while I was in a partial hospitalization program and was spending 5 hours a day, 5 days a week on Zoom meetings, talking about my feelings and talking about EBT and CBT and having 3 one-on-one therapist appointments a week where I just had to talk all about my feelings and my suicidal ideations all the time. So that was a process. That was fun. But it did give me something to work on. And it did also give me a good, like, sort of barometer for where I was on any given day. Like, okay, I'm able to get through this without really identifying it. Whereas if I went through it and I was just like, oh man, Sylvia Plath, just everything speaking to my heart, my soul. I was like, maybe I'm just going to write down maybe I should be journaling instead of reading this book.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for sharing all of that. That is really interesting to hear that you were sort of reading it for the second time. We won't count the first time in high school, right? So reading it for the second time. When you're on a journey that seems so parallel to Esther Greenwood's, I mean, all of the things that you just mentioned are things that are happening in the book, right? She is in this hospitalization program. There is discussion of things like CBT. Well, actually not CBT, but electroconvulsive therapies and all of that. So I can imagine that making a piece of art in response to this book either has the potential to be incredibly therapeutic or incredibly challenging. And from what you described, it sounds like it was like a little 50-50, a little bit of both.
It was. I did make the conscious decision once I had my graduation date for the program that I was not going to actually film or rehearse any of the physical stuff until I was out of the program. I thought that would be pushing myself too hard. And I'm really, really glad that I made that choice. And then after I filmed, I took a week before I went in to look at everything and edit, which is good because the day that I started editing, my grandmother went into hospice. So it was just like, oh, this piece is just, I'm not a big proponent of using your art as therapy, but in this case, it kind of decided it was going to do that for me. Or the universe did. Some higher power decided that I needed to be working on this while going through stuff.
Yeah, sometimes it works out that way, right? I understand what you're saying about like not necessarily using your art as therapy, because art has a relationship not just to its creator, but to the audience. And an audience doesn't always just want to see someone working out their shit, right? But I think what you've created here, which we should watch in just a second, is something that still has an emotional appeal and an investment to the audience. And it's filmed in a really interesting way, right? Like you made a movie, you made a short film as your clown self, translating and visualizing a passage from the bell jar. So let's take a look at that. And as I said at the very top of this episode, this is a piece that has some visuals related to suicidal ideation. So if that's not for you, then you might just want to skip ahead about 3-ish minutes. You'll see when we look like this again that you can start watching again. So let's go ahead and take a look at it.
That morning I had made a start. I had locked myself in the bathroom and run a tub full of warm water and taken out a Gillette blade. When they asked some old Roman philosopher or other how he wanted to die, he said he would open his veins in a warm bath. I thought it would be easy, lying in the tub and seeing the redness flower from my wrists, flush after flush through the clear water till I sank to sleep under a surface gaudy as poppies. But when it came right down to it, the skin of my wrist looked so white and defenseless that I couldn't do it. It was as if what I wanted to kill wasn't in that skin or the thin blue pulse that jumped under my thumb, but somewhere else, deeper, more secret, and a whole lot harder to get at. It would take 2 motions, one wrist, then the other wrist. 3 motions if you counted the changing the razor from hand to hand. Then I would step into the tub and lie down. I moved in front of the medicine cabinet. If I looked in the mirror while I did it, it would be like watching somebody else in a book or a play. but the person in the mirror was paralyzed and too stupid to do a thing. Then I thought, maybe I ought to spill a little blood for practice. So I sat on the edge of the tub and crossed my right ankle over my left knee. Then I lifted my right hand with the razor and let it drop of its own weight, like a guillotine, onto the calf of my leg. I felt nothing. Then I felt a small, deep thrill, and a bright seam of red welled up at the lip of the slash. The blood gathered darkly, like fruit, and rolled down my ankle into the cup of my black patent leather shoe. I thought of getting into the tub then, but I realized my dallying had used up the better part of the morning, and that my mother would probably come home and find me before I was done. So I bandaged the cut, packed up my Gillette blades, and caught the 11:30 bus to Boston.
Maggie, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I can really tell that a tremendous amount of work went into it, and it looks very beautiful. Your bathroom is incredibly clean. I am very impressed by that.
I scrubbed it the night before I shot. I was like, I need to make it very, very clean. It's usually not filthy, but it's never that spotless.
Yeah, well, it looks great. I mean, if that's the only time it looks great, I'm really glad that that's immortalized on film. So you visualized a particular passage from the bell jar, but I'm curious if there are any other passages that really resonated with you besides this one.
So the passage that I originally pitched to Novelties was one towards the beginning of the book when they're at the Ladies' Day magazine banquet, and Esther is describing her way of just taking caviar, and she loves this caviar, and she's just like trying to figure out how to eat all of the caviar at the table. And she has a very particular way of laying out these thin slices of chicken and then like spreading caviar on them like jam and rolling them up and then eating them. And how she had once had lunch with a poet who ate salad with his hands.
Yes.
But he did it so confidently that it didn't seem weird or unnatural. And having to remember that this is a book set in 1953. It was written in like 1961 and released in 1963. Table manners used to matter a lot more. So those actually would have been like, I had to remind myself that those would have been bigger transgressions in the context of the novel. And I just loved that idea of just eating food in a really weird way, but just doing it so forthrightly and so just giving no fucks that everyone is just like, oh yes, this is how you do eat salad with your hands.
This is how you eat salad. Yes. Yes, I love the salad fingers guy. He reminds me obviously of the early internet meme, salad fingers. But he also, I just like want to go on a date with him, right? I want to go on a date with that guy for the story because I love a good story. We have a wonderful story about finding a tooth in a hotel room, Maggie and I, and we'll link you to that in the video description so you can hear it. But just imagine, right, like the story of going out with that guy who eats salad with his hands. It's just what a wonderful idiosyncratic thing. But you're right that it's also this kind of class transgression, and there's so much that's coded in this book about how people are supposed to act based on gender, based on class, also based on race. I mean, this book does not shy away from the fact that it is centered in this really white world. But it's also quite funny, I think. That's one of the things that I really responded to on this read is Esther's voice and how funny she is in describing some of these early moments of her summer in New York.
I think it means more that in the New York section, she's depressed. There's an allegorical suicide of her throwing all of her clothes off the top of a very tall building because she feels like part of her doesn't want to leave. There's an attempted rape. She breaks a dude's nose and then walks home like half naked. there's like these really intense things, but it's always kind of buoyed by her humor. And then I think it makes it far more meaningful when those things happen, but then when she goes home and she's away from like her high speed New York lifestyle and she's back home and not knowing what to do with her life, that you see her in that frame. And it's like, oh no, Esther's not always this depressed person, but right now she doesn't even remember how she felt that way in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some of that humor, I think, is particularly located on the food, as you were saying. So I do want to ask you as a parting gesture today about something you and I both love, which is weird mid-century foods. You love to convince me to make these things. We're fond of a particular cake called a Watergate cake that was very popular in the 1970s. Maggie once sent me a recipe for a weird Jell-O salad that had carrots in it, so I made it for her. I made you that magic cake that Matt Langston sent us one time, which had tomato soup in it. It was very
Campbell's tomato soup.
Yeah, it had a can of Campbell's tomato soup. It was real strange. But if you were to pair this book with a food or a beverage, what do you think you might pair it with? We have to balance the idea that this is a book that is incredibly sad, but also has this incredibly buoyant and often very funny writing. How do we turn it into a food or a drink?
Well, there's a lot of talk about cocktails. And so I think this weird meal needs a cocktail. And by a cocktail, I mean just a glass of straight vodka.
Yeah, that sounds right. Glass of straight up vodka.
That only applies, though, if you do not like vodka. If you do like vodka and you're like, yeah, straight vodka, let's do that, you have to drink something else that you're like not a fan of, but you're going to keep drinking it.
Okay, so for me, it's tequila or Jägermeister. Cool. Got it.
Sorry, even thinking about Jägermeister.
No, those are both gross. That's the right response.
Yeah. And I always think of crab meat when I think of this book and food. I mean, there's the avocado pears, and actually, no, that's what I want. I want to make your own avocado pear bar, like a make your own salad bar. But you get your avocado, and it's got the pit taken out, and there's just like grape jelly and balsamic vinegar and crab and imitation crab meat and I don't know, string cheese, just like anything. And you just get to like throw it on there, and everyone just gets to put whatever they want on there and then eat it however they want at the table. It's not just about the food itself. I think the experience of how you're dining in a group setting is very integral to translating this book into a meal.
Yes, I think you're right that it has to be a dinner party. And you also have to just really hope that nobody gets food poisoning afterward, because we don't want to reenact the book that closely.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, probably not. As I've had food poisoning, it's pretty miserable. I do really love that section, though. It's
again really funny, so funny, and sardonic and witty. And I think that there's so much to love about the bell jar, even though we know the truth of the sadness of it, both from your own perspective and from Plath's own life. But there's really just so much that I think is great about it, and especially because this is a woman's voice writing this in the early 1960s, which is not something that really was done. So I'm grateful that it exists and grateful that you brought us a new interpretation of it today through Ms. Bonnie Bell Blue. Thank you for sharing her with us.
Well, thank you for giving her a chance to perform and process her many, many feelings.
If you want to learn more about Maggie's work, we will put a bunch of links to her personal website, her Instagram, and all of that stuff in the video description. And we hope that you'll join us again for our next episode. So make sure that you hit that subscribe button below the video so that you can catch our episodes as soon as they come out. So thank you so much, Maggie, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for watching Ekphrasis, a production of Novelties Theatre. If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to make a tax-deductible donation through the link in the video description. And don't forget to like and subscribe below so you don't miss our next episode on the Welcome to Nightvale literary universe with BeeBee Sanchez.